Yo, what's good with y'all? Today I'm going to be going over Childe international rotations and other nuances of the team that I often don't see covered in guides. The basis of this team revolves around getting fat nukes with Childe, snapshotting 9,000 buffs onto Xianling's burst, then enabling Vaporize by utilizing Childe's fast hydro application. This means we want to double swirl, stack buffs onto Xiangling, and ensure that Childe's melee stance is off cooldown to enable the Vaporize reaction, which is why the setups for this team matter a lot. One of the best features of this team is the flexible rotations and the ability to distribute damage. Starting off with a standard rotation, I will be breaking down the way it works. Childe E applies 2 units of Hydro. Bennett burst applies 2 units of Pyro, which doesn't completely remove the Hydro since Hydro is the strong side in Vape. For this rotation to work, we need to ensure that there is no aura on the enemy that will mess up the Hydro. We also can't pre-funnel into Bennett since his skill applies 2 units of Pyro, which will remove all of the Hydro in conjunction with his burst. Kazuha's press skill removes all the Hydro, but you will see in this clip that there was no Pyro Swirl because he got a Hydro infusion. Kazuha gets his Pyro infusion from Bennett's self-Pyro application, and his plunge applies the infused element before Animo, which grants us the Pyro Swirl. This means we need to wait for the self-Pyro application before using Kazuha's skill in order to get the Pyro infusion. Kazuha's skill can be held for longer for better grouping without incurring the longer cooldown. Next is Xiangling, who can snapshot all the buffs on both Pyronado and Guoba, so we generally use Guoba after Pyronado for the C6 buff. The last person is Childe, who starts off with a fat nuke, then uses melee stance to enable Vape for 9 seconds. His burst has a 15-second cooldown, so the timer will be at 6 seconds when we have been in melee form for 9 seconds. Looking at the burst cooldown is the easiest way to tell when to swap off. There is usually a bit of leeway since it is recommended to wait after Childe's burst to land before entering melee stance because the skill can steal the Vape. Childe's cooldown is dynamic and has a base cooldown of 6 seconds, with the time you spend in the melee stance added onto the 6 seconds. The reason behind a 15-second cooldown on his melee stance is because it is the perfect amount of time for it to be off cooldown by the time Xianling's burst is back. Another reason to not stay on Childe for longer is due to VV's debuff lasting for 10 seconds. Some of you might be wondering, why not melee burst? There are situations where it is good, such as when you can one cycle, but melee burst has too many downsides for little return. Melee burst has a higher energy cost, which makes getting his burst every rotation more difficult. Additionally, it wastes 2 seconds of melee stance duration, which shortens the amount of time that can be spent in his stance change, enabling Xiangling to Vape. Since multiple rotations are required, being able to burst every rotation and stay in melee form for longer is more valuable. One simple but useful variation to this rotation is to Childe burst before Xiangling burst for multi-wave content. A general piece of advice for multi-wave content is to refresh the VV effect on the second wave of enemies, which is only worth doing if the first wave dies fast enough without entering Childe's melee stance so Pyronado doesn't expire and Childe E is not on cooldown. It is possible to refresh the double swirl if the second wave has multiple enemies by using a Childe charge shot and Kazuha E quickly. Just make sure that the enemy doesn't get hit by Pyronado before the charge shot lands. It is fine if the Pyronado hits the enemy after the charge shot lands since it won't completely remove the Hydro aura. When swirling in multi-target scenarios, don't apply Hydro to all of the enemies because it will make it impossible to remove the Hydro aura, preventing the Pyro Swirl from happening on the plunge. Variance in the setup will be the deciding factors for which elemental status the enemy ends up with, which is crucial for vaping Childe's ult. Another thing to keep in mind is that it is pretty much impossible to remove the Hydro Aura on enemies in Kazuha's ult. Childe E is on cooldown, so we need another source of Hydro application to double swirl. Charge Shot only applies 1 unit of Hydro, and Bennett Q applies 2 units of Pyro, which removes all of the Hydro, leaving none to swirl. The solution is to use Charge Shot after Bennett burst. One Charge Shot yields 2 instances of Hydro application. The initial hit will remove the Pyro, and Riptide Flash will apply another instance of Hydro. Although this isn't utilized very often, it is possible to get a Hydro Swirl even when many Pyro application sources are active. In an AoE scenario where the enemies are tightly grouped, make sure the enemies have a Pyro Aura before triggering Riptide Flash to ensure not all enemies have a Hydro Aura, since it will make double swirling impossible. Hold E is mandatory to remove all the Hydro. One thing to keep in mind is that you need another enemy to have a Pyro Aura to end with Pyro. This can be done with Guoba or Bennett E without hitting the enemy with a Hydro Aura. In multi-wave content, it is important to stay in Childe's melee stance and apply the Riptide mark to the wave of enemies you'll be performing your setup on. This rotation can be used when you need to recharge bursts at the beginning of the chamber because battering Xiangling usually leaves the enemy with a Pyro Aura, which will cause Childe's E to vape instead of leaving a Hydro Aura on the enemy. Just make sure to Childe E to apply the Riptide mark at the very beginning. Using aim shots is not always practical, and there are ways of transitioning into second rotation which allows for double swirling without them. The trick is to quickly Kazuha E right after swapping off Childe to swirl Hydro, but this rotation will only work if you stay in Childe's melee stance for long enough for Kazuha's buffs to still be active by the time Childe's burst is off cooldown. One downside to this rotation is that the VV effect will not last long enough for Childe's melee stance, but having VV for burst is more important. Some general tips is that after swapping off of Childe, the Hydro applied by his melee stance lasts long enough for Kazuha to swirl or Bennett to proc instructors with, and going back to Kazuha to refresh VV is a good way to gap fill Childe's E cooldown, as well as having better energy economy and a higher VV uptime. There is a rotation where a charge shot can be used before Bennett burst, and it can be more practical in situations where using a charge shot later on is impossible. Generally speaking, Noblesse Oblige is more flexible since its set effect lasts for 12 seconds and will be better in the second rotation if it takes longer to recharge bursts, since the instructor's buff has a short duration of 8 seconds. Depending on the situation, there are other rotations that will work better. One other rotation is to use a charge shot to apply Hydro to an enemy that's further away and position yourself to not hit them with Bennett's burst to get the double swirl. A miscellaneous tip I have is double swirling without Bennett burst. Guoba applies Pyro to himself, which Kazuha can use to get a Pyro infusion. Only Sucrose and Farazan can swirl the Pyro on Guoba, which makes Sucrose better against enemies with permanent auras because they can proc Veritas Infiniter. International rotations are not set in stone, and you can craft your own to suit your needs and adapt to different situations. One example is a rotation for Magu Kenki, which I think is pretty neat. Childe's charge shot applies Riptide Mark and Hydro, Guoba to help one-shot Magu Kenki and drop a Chili for Xiangling, Kazuha's skill for Hydro Swirl and reapply Hydro for Bennett to get Instructor's buff, Childe Burst and E to apply 2 units of Hydro, which allows for both Instructor's buff refresh and Hydro Swirl, Xiangling snapshots all the buffs, and Childe starts driving Xiangling. And Magu Kenki basically gets slaughtered. With that being said, that is all I have to share for this video. I hope the breakdown of the different intricacies of this team enables you to take your international team to the next level.